It's again my great pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague and dear friend Lorenzo Chiesa, who is also with today organizing this event, and thanks also on this occasion for putting together this. Lorenzo is a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle, or Newcastle University. He has written extensively on the topics in psychoanalysis, contemporary philosophy, Marxism, Italian theory, biopolitics, and a couple of other topics. Today, well, yeah, before I give you the floor, Lorenzo is the author of several also important books. The first one in English is Subjectivity and Otherness and dates in 2007. So we are approaching 20 years of the publication, which is something. And then most recently in 2016, Virtual Point of Freedom with Northwestern University Press, and the Not To Logic and Gut in Lacan with MIT Press, and I think today we got the news that you have a forthcoming book with Bloomsbury toward the end of this year, co-authored with Adrian Johnston, and the title is, correct me if I'm wrong, but The Gut is Undead. And the title of Lorenzo's talk today is The Unconscious is a Concept. Ontogenesis, structure, and form. The floor is yours, Lorenzo.
Thank you. For Lacan, the unconscious is a concept. Lacan italicizes is in this quote. Namely, to put it bluntly, it is not a thing. Paradigmatically, it is not, quote, that part of psychic reality which does not have the attribute or virtue of consciousness or the instinctual, end of quote. Yet, it is something precisely as a concept. In passing, we may even go as far as suggesting that it is the unconscious that is as a concept that manages to determine the thing, with a capital T, as the concept of what is not, pure and simple. Lacan stands very firm on the unconscious being a concept. Far from jokingly, he says, the unconscious is what I say it is, namely a concept. Conversely, quote, the unconscious prior to Freud is not, italicized, purely and simply, end of quote. The unconscious that is as a concept is more precisely what can be thought of as, quote, the trace left by that which operates to constitute the subject, end of quote. We should be extremely careful here. That which ontogenetically constitutes the subject and makes him be founds, Lacan says, the subject's thinking, the unconscious qua concept. Yet, that which founds the subject's thinking, the unconscious qua concept, not simply as the ontological concept of the subject's thinking his constitution, but also and especially as such, in a much stronger sense, as these concepts' very being. The unconscious is a concept, ontologically says something more than and quite different from the unconscious is a concept. Or which is the same, the unconscious that is as a concept should primarily be read as the unconscious as a concept that is. One of the overall wagers in my current book project is to show how the phrase the unconscious is a concept is no longer merely descriptive of the ontogenesis and structure of the subject. The unconscious is a concept is also and above all ontologically formal, or better, formalizable. Namely, it concerns the form of the presentation of being. Following Badiou's own wager, quote Badiou, conceptually, it is within form and formalization that I will testify to the existence of an ontology in Lacan, end of quote. Moving from this, in my current project, I subsequently articulate how such a formal and formalizable understanding of the unconscious as a concept that is grounds, in turn, our thinking of A, the ontogenetic structural advent of the subject, as B, the possibility of the procedural subject of the event, the subject to truth, and does so beyond formalization. Now, none of what I've just said could be achieved without first showing that that which at stake in the above quotation is nothing other than the concept of the letter, of a trait that leaves a trace, namely the unconscious as trace. On the eventful level, such a trait has also to be taken as a matheme, which matheme formalizes the impasse of formalization. Following Badiou, the matheme, will have to be considered as a supernumerary extra letter, or one more letter. Bear in mind that for Lacan himself, ultimately, I quote Lacan, what constitutes a concept is very precisely the function of a limit, as ultimately the limit of formalization, end of quote. Above all, bear in mind that as per a famous and much misunderstood Lacanian trope, the instance and insistence of the concept of the letter in the unconscious is ultimately what the concept of the unconscious, structure like a language, is all about. The unconscious is the letter. The concept of the unconscious is the concept of the letter. Again, the unconscious amounts to a trace of the letter as trait. For Lacan, if there is a core of reason, as he says, since Freud, then this is it. Or better, this is it. Now, to provide you with some additional and non-Lacanian general orientation about my project, I would say that there are 3 levels in Lacan's ontology of the subject in brackets. The first level is ontogenetically and structurally descriptive and chiefly based on the empirical experience of psychoanalysis. The second level is ontologically formal and by and large equivalent to Badiou's use of set theoretical mathematics as the only appropriate discourse on being structured. The third level relies on both the descriptive empirical and ontologically formal levels, but also supersedes these levels, including in an ethical and political direction, and is ultimately comparable to Badiou's meta-ontological theory of the subject of the event, the subject to truth. In the rest of this presentation, I will mostly focus only on the first level, so the descriptively, ontogenetic, and structural, and the link between the first level to the second level, that is to say, the ontologically formal level. Let me take a step back, a huge step back here, and tackle Lacan's claim that the unconscious is a concept. We should ask, what is then more precisely the concept of the unconscious? What is it ontogenetically? Where is henceforth the structural position of the unconscious? Why should we, in addition to such a ontogenetically and structurally descriptive level, also and especially consider the unconscious as a concept that formally is? And how is the concept of the latter as itself both descriptive of ontogenesis and structure, as well as ontologically formal, crucial in all this? Although they are strictly entwined and hence difficult to divide, let us tackle the above questions one by one, which is what I will do in this presentation. Concerning the first question, what is the concept of the unconscious? The concept of the unconscious, through which Lacan accounts for the subject's adventitious and retrospective coming into structure being, and on which, through a self-reinforcing feedback loop between practice and theory, Lacan organizes the psychoanalytical treatment, we should immediately stress an obvious yet underestimated fact. Seminar 11, again, like with Alenka. For Lacan, the unconscious is what? It is one of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, of Lacan's refoundation and even reinvention of psychoanalysis. Far from coincidentally, the unconscious is the first concept in this list, the others being repetition, transference, and the drive. Against mainstream post-Freudian schools, the unconscious does not amount to a part of psychic reality in which instincts would dwell. The unconscious does not amount to a, quote Lacan, Seminar 11, will considered as primordial, something that precedes consciousness, end of quote. By substantializing the unconscious, these post-Freudian schools, Lacan says, refuse the concept tout court, end of quote. However convoluted their theoretical examination of the unconscious might be, these schools instead treated the unconscious as a sort of ready-made psychoanalytical object. In this sense, and only in this sense, against post-Freudians, for Lacan, the unconscious should rather be understood as pre-ontological, Lacan's phrase. Namely, again, the unconscious is not a reified part of psychic reality. This is a very subtle point, I think, which has often been misconceived even by otherwise scrupulous Lacanians. This idea that the unconscious is pre-ontological. That the unconscious is pre-ontological for Lacan does not mean that it is a reality that comes prior to ontological reality as structured, for instance, in the fashion of a pre-subjective drive as a quintessential dimension of being, which is basically the same as what post-Freudians claim, albeit with an alternative jargon. It means, on the contrary, that the unconscious should be approached as the concept of something that remains, Lacan says, non-realized in terms of reality as structured. Lacan importantly adds that this conceptually grasped non-realized is, quote Lacan, nothing unreal nor dereal, but a larval zone of reality as structured. So what we witness here is, I think, a complete reversal of the post-Freudian and, for Lacan, anti-Freudian unconscious. Instead of a reality, the unconscious is a concept. Instead of a well-defined part of the psyche, it is conceptually a larval zone. Instead of being instinctual and those pre-structural, the conceptual larval zone is obtained only along with structured reality, and it is as such non-realized, yet not unreal or the real. What is more, with the concept of the unconscious capturing something that is not unreal or the real, but real, precisely as a non-realized lying beside structured reality, this concept stands afar from any more or less sophisticated, I would say, idealistic drift. Instead, both post-Freudians champions of a free-floating libido and Lacanian supporters of a acephalous drive succumb to such a idealistic drift. Even further, the conceptualization of the unconscious that I take as Lacan's own does not only aim at seizing structured reality in a more realistic way, but also with the same move at realizing itself, the concept. I quote Lacan, "Our conception of the concept of the unconscious, if it is actually modeled on a supposed approach to reality that it is made to apprehend, it is only by a leap, a passage to the limit, that it manages the concept to realize itself." End of quote. Now, moving from these vast and very powerful, I think, premises, in Seminar 11, Lacan subsequently proceeds to tackle the ontogenetic scope of the concept of the unconscious, our second question, namely how it seizes the subject's insertion into and sustainment of structured reality and its inextricable larval zone. First, so we are into ontogenesis now. First, the background against which ontogenesis takes place should not be mistaken, Lacan says, with an absence or lack. Quote, "Where is the background? Question mark. Is it absence? Not at all. Rupture, the split, the trait of the opening makes later absence emerge." End of quote. This is perfectly in line with what Lacan stresses in a passage from the contemporary article Position of the Unconscious, a passage singled out approvingly also by Badiou. The absolutely nothing, Lacan's phrase, of which Lacan speaks, is not there to begin with, and its absolutely nothing retroactive advent necessitates the establishment of the unconscious fantasy. Such an establishment includes at the same time a rupture, that is to say, the encounter with the other's desire, a split, the subject's mapping himself onto the object of fantasy, but also simultaneously the Spaltung between the subject of the unconscious and the self-conscious ego, and a trait, that is to say, the nonsensical primary signifier through which the advent of the absolutely nothing is both opened and immediately repressed. Second, the subject of the unconscious can certainly overall be said to be an effect of the signifier. Quote Lacan, "Language is the cause," end of quote. But on the other hand, and more problematically, in a more complex manner, as also noted by Lacan in Seminar 11, given the retroactive temporality in question, It is the very subject of the unconscious as an effect of the signifier that introduces the signifier as cause into the subject. Yet the subject is not the cause of itself. In other words, as Lacan clearly puts it in Seminar 11, outside of this retroactivity, quote Lacan, whenever we speak of cause, there is always something anti-conceptual, indefinite, end of quote. We may add, what is anti-conceptual, what lies outside the ontogenetic concept of the subject of the unconscious as a background, is in the end the cause of language itself, of language as a retroactive cause. Namely, we cannot but conclude the eventual emergence of language as such, namely the phylogenetic question of anthropogenesis as such. This anti-conceptual outside should not be confused with what lies beside structured reality as a larval zone. I repeat this passage, it's quite crucial. This anti-conceptual outside should not be confused with what lies beside structured reality as a larval zone, which is instead the most integral component of the ontogenetic concept of the subject of the unconscious. Despite commentators' confusion, Lacan is very precise here. Ontologically, the anti-conceptual outside's indefiniteness, as not an absence, does not coincide with the conceptual larval zones non-realized as real, although the former is only given through the latter. Third, and we are now transitioning from a more ontogenetic to a more structural account of the concept of the subject of the unconscious, moving from our first to our second question, the subject of the unconscious consists of a gap, Lacan says. Lacan advances that the gap, quote, is situated between the cause and what it, the cause, affects, end of quote. This is a way, I think, to conceptually position the subject of the unconscious while also taking into consideration both its diachronic ontogenesis and its synchronic structure. The subject of the unconscious as a gap can be said to take place both, Lacan says, A, diachronically between the indefinite cause and neurosis, that is to say, the self-conscious subject's symptoms and the other formations of the unconscious that surface in subconsciousness, and B, synchronically, in a circumscribed and clinically testable way between the law of the signifier as cause, itself caused by the indefinite cause, and the same neurotic formations. Initially, the latter acceptation of the gap, B above, seems itself only diachronic and not synchronic. Yet Lacan tellingly speaks of, quote, introducing in the domain of the cause the law of the signifier at the place where the gap is produced, end of quote. The law of the signifier as cause is here at the very place of the gap. That is to say, the position of the unconscious as a gap is here also synchronic with the law of the signifier that causes it. It doesn't simply lie between the cause and its effects, that is to say, neurosis. It precariously subsists in fantasy, and it does so in a logical time without duration, Lacan says. This is how Lacan relaunches Freud's claim that the subject of the unconscious ultimately turns out to be, quote, inaccessible to spatial temporal localization and even the function of time, end of quote. In all honesty, I think that in Seminar 11, Lacan does not always manage to clearly pin down the intersection of the diachronic and synchronic coordinates of the concept of the unconscious as structural. But in his compte rendu of the seminar, he gets straight to the crux of the matter, I think. Quote Lacan, "The unconscious that we have upheld according to our inaugural intention as the effect of the signifier, which continues to be the case structurally after ontogenesis has taken place, was here resumed also as a temporal pulsation," end of quote. So, on the one hand, diachronically, the subject of the unconscious as a gap first, quote Lacan, appears to us as a phenomenon of discontinuity in self-consciousness, as made particularly evident by some formations of the unconscious, especially jokes in this instance. Such a discontinuity consists of, in an instantaneous sequence, Lacan says, a discovery, surprise, and the loss of these. But on the other hand, and without solution of continuity, within this diachronic discontinuity, quote Lacan, something like a wobbling, vacillation, is manifested synchronically, end of quote. Now, of course, a temporal pulsation or wobbling that in its repetition in fantasy remains inaccessible to the function of time stands as little more than an oxymoron, if not further investigated, unless we take the function of time to simply refer to self-conscious spatiotemporality. In that case, as I showed elsewhere, for Lacan, the unconscious as a synchronic gap, the unconscious fantasy at bottom, can indeed not be accessed without collapsing both fantasy and self-consciousness. Lacan does not develop the temporal pulsation wobbling argument in Seminar 11. Still, I would suggest that what he is here struggling with via the temporal pulsation wobbling as only synchronic is the delineation of a concept of the subject of the unconscious as also the concept of the structural unconscious without the subject of the unconscious. After all, in fantasy, the subject's coming into being, advent, coincides with his radical desubjectivation in the object. From a slightly different perspective, we might be facing here the void's pulsation and wobbling. In Badiou's not too dissimilar language, there persists a structural wandering of the void, which might thereafter coalesce in a convocation of the void at an eventual site located at the edge of the void, a convocation which in turn does not issue into a disastrous fixing of the void. Such a convocation instead fleetingly transpire as what Lacan himself would call a, however anxiety-inducing, positive image of lack, the absence, quote, where we are beside self-consciousness. As I try to argue later in my project, I think the true position of the Lacanian unconscious is that of a Badiousian eventual site. Let's leave this completely aside now. For now, what should directly interest us, and we are now moving to address the fourth question concerning the formal dimension of the concept of the unconscious, what should directly interest us is the following. While Lacan expectedly understands the unconscious qua gap as ontically fragile, his phrase, ontically fragile, he also less expectedly claims at the same time, quote, what is at stake with this gap is a strictly speaking ontological function which is not fragile, end of quote. Regarding such ontological function, Lacan speaks of nothing less than my ontology. Are we recovering here an unsolvable tension clumsily masked with inaccurate philosophical jargon. I think the opposite is the case, although these passages, difficult passages from Seminar 11, are seriously compromised by Miller's tendentiously anti-philosophical editorial decisions. On the one hand, what shows itself through this gap, which is sized in two related guises, Lacan recalls, namely discontinuity and the pulsation, is ontically fragile as elusive. In this sense, and in this sense only, the unconscious, quote Lacan, does not lend itself to an ontology, end of quote. But we should specify that the unconscious that does not lend itself to an ontology, that the unconscious proves incompatible, in this sense, only with a phenomenological ontology. And it is equal in this sense that the unconscious, as the non-realized, and as such real, is, quote Lacan, neither being nor non-being, end of quote. It remains, again, pre-ontological, Lacan insists, on the level of phenomenology, to put it very bluntly. But on the other hand, and this is central to my overall argument today, the unconscious is ontically, phenomenologically fragile as elusive only with respect to that which its ontogenetic and structural concept descriptively sizes in terms of reality. On the contrary, precisely because of the non-realized or non-reified status of what is being sized, the concept of the unconscious has as such also a strictly ontological function in that it formally is. It formally is as the concept of the cat, Lacan says, or which is the same of the trait, the latter of which I will privilege here, as in this context the trait becomes basically synonymous with the letter. Now, while the phenomenological reality of the unconscious as a two-faced gap can already intuitively be grasped as a cat, more clearly on the side of the diachronic discontinuity, and as a trait, more clearly on the side of the synchronic pulsation, this is not what Lacan primarily has in mind. Already in Seminar 11, he goes much farther than this. The pre-ontological, non-realized gap already envisaged by Freud must undergo, he says, an ulterior, quote, leap to realize itself, end of quote, I would add, in a formal way, beyond this descriptive level. At the beginning of his discussion in Seminar 11, Lacan immediately introduces the concept of the unconscious as realistically sizing structural reality to the extent that it relates to structural reality, like, he says, the letters of infinitesimal calculus as form relate to it. Most importantly, the entire argument we've so far dissected and reconstructed much more systematically culminates in two astonishing series of claims. Let's scrutinize these quotes. They're dense and I will repeat them. First, quote Lacan, Seminar 11. The true function of the descriptively ontogenetic and structural concept of the unconscious is actually to be in profound, initial, inaugural relation with the formal function of concept itself, of the Unbegriff, the non-concept, that is the Begriff, the concept, of the original one of the concept, namely the cat. I repeat, it's dense. The true function of the descriptively ontogenetic and structural concept of the unconscious is actually to be in profound, initial, inaugural relation with the formal function of concept as such, of the Unbegriff, the non-concept in German, that is the Begriff, the concept of the original one of the concept, namely the cat. Second difficult quote, the one, Lacan speaking, the one that is introduced through the psychoanalytic experience of the unconscious is the one of the trait. Here there springs up a unrecognized form of the one. If you want, still quoting, let's say that it is not a unifying one, that it is instead the one of the trait, the one of the trait of the Unbewusste, the unconscious in German. Still quoting, we could say that the limit of the Unbewusste is the Unbegriff, the non-concept, which, however, is not a non-concept, complex. I repeat this quote. The one that is introduced through the psychoanalytic experience of the unconscious is the one of the trait. Here, there springs up an unrecognized form of the one. If you want, let's say that it is not a unifying one, that it is instead the one of the trait of the Unbewusste, the unconscious. We could say that the limit of the Unbewusste is the Unbegriff, the non-concept, which Unbegriff, however, is not a non-concept. Now, there is a lot to be unpacked in these two fabulous, undeniably dense, apparently contradictory, but extremely lucid, I think, quotes, where we first come to appreciate the sweeping implication of what, in support of Lacan, in a minor article, Badiou calls Lacan's being as letter. Here we can move beyond simplistic mantras, such as the unconscious is structured like a language, or even the unconscious is made of letters stuck in the flesh. In this presentation, I cannot directly tackle the letter and how its formal dimension, based on the trait, goes together with mathematical formalization. But let me try to single out the kernel, at least the kernel, of Lacan's argument with respect to the unconscious itself. Now, what I will do to conclude is try to analyze those two difficult quotes. I think the basic point at stake in those two related quotes is quite straightforward. What is the basic point? The basic point is, as Lacan puts it, the Unbewusste, unconscious in German, is, italicized, the Begriff. This is a neologism, Begriff. That is to say, in French, one, plus Begriff, concept in German. So, the Unbewusste, the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious, is the Lacanian Begriff. The unconscious, we could say, is, in a very specific sense, the one concept. This is, in a nutshell, Lacan's ontology on the level of being structured as letter. The Freudian pre-ontological unconscious, Unbewusste, as sized ontogenetically and structurally, realizes itself at its limit, recall, into the Lacanian ontological one concept, un Begriff, as formal. Or better, the former, the Unbewusste, formally is, as cat, as trait, the concept of the one, a one that, however, crucially, a one that is not. A one that is not, if not, as a concept. Lacan is again eloquent on this last point. Quote, is the one anterior to discontinuity? I don't think so. End of quote. For what we previously considered, this also means that for Lacan, there is for him neither one, nor absence, nor absolutely nothing prior to the trait. To dwell on this, closely paraphrasing the quotes and expanding on them, we could even say that thanks to psychoanalytic experience, we obtain the formal function of the concept as such, namely of how what can retroactively be thought as non-conceptual, unbegriff, or inconsistent, is conceptualized through the one concept, unbegriff. One concept as trait, as operation, not as result. Broadly speaking, by means of psychoanalysis, but well beyond its discipline-bound domain, what is, in general, as presented, cannot but fundamentally be presented as structured, or we should rather say unpresented as structured, through the one of the trait, or better at this stage, is more appropriate at this stage, since this one is not only, Lacan says, not a closed one, the false unity of the mirage of the psyche as an envelope, but also not the first natural number. It is, to simplify instead, a zero, an empty set, or what Lacan calls a formal void. We should also stress that, importantly, the Unbegriff, the non-concept, qua unpresented as structured by the Unbegriff, does not equate with what Lacan earlier aptly named, with respect to the cause of language, the anti-conceptual. We can discuss this, difficult but super interesting, I think. Lacan makes here the point that the non-concept, the Unbegriff, is not the anti-conceptual, quite the opposite. Here, Lacan's convergence with Badiou's understanding of the letter as Badiou's phrase, pure multiple, as that which Badiou's phrase designates a multiple in general, is at its zenith. The same goes with Badiou's contiguous concepts of the count as one. Quote Badiou, given that the one is not, every situation is structured by the count as one, end of quote. And Badiou's void, quote Badiou, the non-one of every count as one, whereby it comes down to exactly the same thing to say that the void is the operation of the count, and to say that the void is the pure multiple upon which the count operates, end of quote. I think it's quite stunning that, notwithstanding several advanced elucubrations on these pages of Seminar 11, Lacan's very elaborate ontology has not earnestly been picked up any earlier, not even by Badiou himself, apart from a little-known 1989 lecture in which he, surprisingly, Badiou states that, quote, if that is Lacanian psychoanalysis, then it is a philosophy homogeneous to mine, end of quote. However, even in this instance, in confusing Lacan's descriptive and formal levels, not to mention the procedural level, Badiou misses the specificity of Lacan's multi-layered reasoning on being as letter. Over and above that, elsewhere in his work, referring to Seminar 11 in these very passages, Badiou misleadingly insists on the pre-ontological status of the Lacanian unconscious as the ultimate validation of the fact that Lacan would not really have, or even intend to have, an ontology. In these instances, Badiou's Lacan is not Lacan, but Jacques-Alain Miller. To sum up, the leap Lacan calls for when he states that we can only accomplish the concept of the unconscious by carrying it, concept, to its limit, is the leap from the Freudian Unbewusste as phenomenologically non-realized to the Unbegriff as formally the original one of the concept, namely the cat, via the retrospective Unbegriff. It should now be evident that what is at stake in the metonymical shift from Unbewusste, the unconscious, to Unbegriff, the non-concept, and then to Unbegriff, the one concept, is much more than a mere pun. Maybe we could, in all seriousness, even baptize this provisional endpoint, namely the Lacanian un-begriff, the one conscious, but spelling it U-A-N, conscious. We thus have moved from the unconscious is a concept to the unconscious is a concept, and even a concept that ontologically delivers us the form of the concept to cool, of any real concept whatsoever. The one conscious is, or also the one conscious is, spelled W-A-N, so as not to forget that the un-begriff also captures the foundations of desire as want to be. To alliterate all this in a Lacanian Chiesa neologism of being as letter, one conscious. However, this is just the first in a series of ingenious and greatly underestimated leaps Lacan promotes for psychoanalysis not to bounce back from the pre-ontological unconscious to the circular closure of structure as one, but use unwarranted accusation, or worse, to the alleged pre-structural thing. The next most noticeable leaps will be, in this order, in my opinion, A, the ontological formalization of the formal one through set theory, B, the concept of the act as a passage from the formal to the procedural level, and C, the idea of a psychoanalytic field in which a truth procedure of psychoanalysis can be unfolded. These are, roughly speaking, the remaining main coordinates of my current project. At this juncture, to conclude, in order not to ourselves end up confusing the descriptive and formal levels of Lacan's ontology, while also evidencing their strict entwinement, it is vital to fully acknowledge that the cut or trait that, as un-begriff, gives us the formal function of the concept itself is, quote Lacan, profoundly linked to the function as such of the subject in its constituent relation to the signifier itself, end of quote. This may seem at first sight as a innocuous statement, almost a Lacanian truism. Of course, the subject itself is constituted in relation to the signifier in fantasy, thanks to the cut or trait of the primary signifier. But if this is indeed the case, then I think what Lacan is pointing at is, on closer inspection, something much more ambitious and complex, namely how to think the link between the formal and the ontogenetic structural dimensions of the trait or un-begriff. Developing his remark, we could say that the formal concept of the unconscious, condensed in the un-begriff as ontologically strong, is to be applied to the ontogenetic and structural concept of the unconscious, which instead sizes the unconscious only as ontically, phenomenologically weak. Yet, precisely by means of this application, the unconscious as ontically weak, as non-realized, is itself formally sized as ontologically strong. To put it bluntly, the fact that the unconscious formally is a concept gives us also, but not only, what the subject of the unconscious and of subconsciousness ontogenetically and structurally really is. What is it? It is the outcome of the trait, the letter, the one concept as count or operation, as well as the retrospective non-concept. As Lacan puts it, when dealing with the concept of the unconscious, quote, it is always a question of the subject as indeterminate, end of quote. Moreover, dialectically, this is also how the concept of the unconscious really realizes itself. The one as trait is also what operates in ontogenesis and structure. Hence, the formal concept of the one as trait really is because the one as trait is ontogenetically and structurally embodied by the subject and formally cogitated about by the subject. Understanding the unconscious as letters stuck in the flesh is only at this stage no longer just a facile analogy. With those need to move not only from the ontogenetic structural level to the formal level, but also from the formal level back to the ontogenetic structural level. Being structured for the animal that contingently happens to speak ultimately and most prominently amounts to thinking formally its own advent as a subject, or better, thinking formally the latter as the inconsistency of the trait, the one concept, the Begriff. This Lacanian revival and amplification of Freud's Wo es war, soll ich werden opens a space for the possibility of a subject of the event. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Dense, fabulous, brilliant. Now it's the time for comments, questions, etc. As in previous session, and as usual, try to keep it as short as possible.
Well, I'm not a man, so I won't have that problem. Thank you, Lorenzo, for the dazzling tour de force. Although you didn't mention the écrit that I will mention just now, we talked about it yesterday, and I think your presentation just makes this very clear. Just to repeat the axiom of your paper, the unconscious as a concept that formally is, given the emphasis of your paper on the is, I feel inclined to mention the st of l'étourdi, which sort of sounds like, you know, the est of Indo-European existere, etc., etc. Existence and so on. I mean, it comes in the écrit at the same time where Lacan is setting up what makes possible the Umwelt, the man leap, and so on and so on. So I was just wondering what form of existence is taking place in your axiom, like the is it existence, is it broken by a hyphen existence, and so on. So what concept of existence is captured by the is of your axiom of the unconscious as a concept that formally is?
I'm not sure there is, like, certainly not with reference to Seminar 11, like a clear, well-delineated notion of existence as subjective existence. I don't know, like, whether phenomenologically or in a quasi-Sartrean way. I don't have an answer to that. I don't think like that would be like a traditional philosophical concept that, you know, figures as such in this incredibly dense theoretical arsenal, right? In a sense, like when I'm talking about the ontogenetic and structural level of the unconscious is,
yes.
That basically, to be very rough, corresponds to, you know, the subject's conscious and unconscious, primarily, existence. But in a very rough sense. I mean, the later Lacan will focus on existence, but only by triangulating a notion, as you well know in your research, with inexistence and existence, in a sense. But to answer your question, so first I said I couldn't answer your question because existence is not really explicitly in this context present. But to answer your question, basically, my point would be to say that the unconscious is a concept beyond the existence of the subject of the unconscious. And that actually, in order to actually go beyond that descriptive level, ontogenetic, structural, contiguously, that level is the level of existence, isn't it? You know, ontogenesis coming into existence, if you wish. Structure is structuring existence. My argument is to say that there is a notion of the concept of the unconscious, according to Lacan, which is actually the trait. which formally gives you the form of the concept, and hence, in a sense, we cannot but think back ontogenesis and structure, existence, if you wish, from that formal perspective, which is as yet in Seminar 11 not formalized. This is what I couldn't cover. Then the missing link is like, why do you have to move from the formal level, which is the level of the trait, or if you are Badiousian, of the count as one as sheer operation. Right. Then, of course, what is not in this paper, obviously it's like the main topic in my new project, is the passage from this formal level to the formalized level. At this level, you don't need mathematics.
And when you slapped the table, I couldn't help but think of the st and l'étourdi, the c, t.
Yeah. Well, l'étourdi is actually, I think, applying what l'étourdi as a text is putting into practice what Lacan here in Seminar 11 is still basically treating theoretically. Yes. L'étourdi, it's clearly like, a step beyond somehow. What I think, also to open up the discussion linked with other papers, I think what I'm trying to do, in one sentence, in this specific paper, is quite close to today's conclusion about Freud. And I was pushing today a bit yesterday when you say like, the marker, right? It, or even like Aleš earlier on Nietzsche, right? Even it is too much in this context. And then one has to go beyond that, but this is the beginning.
I actually have a response, if I may. You're hitting the table, right? Reminded me that I forgot about one metapsychological insight in, like, that properly really fits into my definition of a metapsychological insight, which is not Freudian, but with Wilhelm Stekel. So in the text that I know about this because I've translated this paper, so I wouldn't realize I didn't read Stekel a lot. So, but this is a paper called "The Hand Is Being Beaten," right? So it's about a masochist, and there is a great. I mean, even Stekel has some insight from time to time. He said that this patient, right, was. Which was known to be to like hit people and being hit, right? He said that this was the way of that he satisfied by hitting himself and other people his need for contact, and he said that the beating, right, or the hit is the pure minimum of a contact, right, of a touch. So, which is great to me, right? Because it's really purely ambivalent, right? You don't want to touch, but you touch for a shortest amount of time, and this hurts, right? No, it's just.
The example of theatrics were misleading.
No, I'm half joking, but
No, it's not a matter of touching. Like if you read the text, I just have like a bar. Or as we know, in Newcastle, you can also do this. It's okay, right? You can do this, you can do that. I mean, to communicate, like I just. But the physical dimension is relevant here.
No, but actually I have a kind of continuation of this humorous interpretation of yourself, which was nevertheless quite physical and quite present, because, to illustrate even physically a mark, a threat with slamming on the table, it's already a choice, let's say. And I was actually reminded, is it not something that here nevertheless comes up, which you really kind of refused to take into consideration, this kind of Lacanian mantra that ontology, okay, being at someone's orders, being on someone's beck and call, maître, like maître and être, that boof, this is precisely how you bring in being. You know what I mean? That there is a certain kind of, that it was perhaps not just an accident, because it was a kind of, but then, how do you, respond? It's, Lacan is definitely extremely, if not ambiguous, about precisely this point. What is the being that is not precise, or would you simply say, yeah, this is how, because this gesture of the master that just hits something or whatever, gives an order, or do you differentiate this from the theory of the threat that you were?
Absolutely, yes. This is the question I
Sorry.
was waiting for. Thank you, Alenka. Yes, because let's look at it like ontogenetically. It's the easiest.
Can you answer into the mic?
Let's look. I mean, let's think of it. So Alenka's final question was like, like the of the master, and I get it, even seminar 17. How is that different or not from the kind of trait, gentler? I think there's a huge difference. In a sense, I think like what the difference between the two is between, more technically, in Lacanian jargon, is the difference between the unary trait and the primary signifier. So even in terms of the ontogenesis of the logical fantasy, to go back to your paper, like there is a situation, and I use the term quite in a but use a manner, in which we have negative trait. The trait is already negation, right? The unary trait, the clear example would be for da, or like breastfeeding and weaning, etc., right? So the trait that formally is, at the most basic level, is the unary trait. Now, the primary signifier, which is the signifier that, let's simplify, puts together all these traits, whereby you have a fantasy, that would be the master signifier. And interestingly, I totally agree, because the master signifier, if you remember, or the discourse of the master even, like the master doesn't know what he wants, it orders, right? So you do have this level of the trait also on the level of the master signifier, right? I mean, let me put it like that. I think more technically, the way because I addressed this specific question you asked, I think in a sense, the unary trait, what I was talking about here, will have been the primary signifier after primary repression is accomplished, after you have fantasy. So the function of what I was trying to explain today is the same function as the function of the master signifier, but the master signifier pops up only on the level, basically, of what you were talking about. That is to say, the level where you have fantasy, and if you have fantasy, which is the unconscious, to simplify, you also have self-consciousness. So structurally speaking, so ontogenetically, let me put it more precisely. Ontogenetically, I think it's very important to distinguish the unary trait from the primary signifier. So what I was trying to do was not a primary signifier, a master signifier, right? Ontogenetically, but structurally, they are de facto undistinguishable. And then the further complication is that at the end of the day, formalization for Lacan is very strictly connected with what we are discussing. So that would be another step, another complication. I hope I try to answer.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. I'll try to be brief with your very immensely thought-provoking talk. My question refers to the passage that you invoked in Seminar 11 precisely, regarding the quote-unquote ontology of the unconscious, specifically, like, it's not being, it's not being, but rather maybe proposes another level of negativity, namely unbeing, something like that, right? And precisely this is where Badiou endorses this passage in Theory of the Subject, right? Says this is what suits our ontology. In that session, I believe it's the first of the Lacan destruction section of that book. And from what I can hear regarding your presentation is a very close idea to this project of that book up until then, is trying to account for the emergence of structure, right? Because every time we try to account for the emergence of structure in terms of structure, right, in just plain negation, it never works, right? You just think in, or talk in terms of the one, right? You say, oh, well, where is the emergence of structure in structural terms? Say, oh, it's there. What do you do then? You structuralize it, right? So you no longer indicate the outside of structure. But I think what if I get you correctly, your excellent move is to say, no, it's not just outside, but beside.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, in other words, maybe to say something like splitting the unconscious into two, or splitting the outplace into two in more Badiousian language. I think what I'm hearing, right, is the move from the descriptive to the formal level can be represented in, as you say, the wandering void, or, and of course, like, as we all well know, right, the formalization of the name of being it's barred. Right, it is split, like on a really stupid level, right?
Yeah.
It is split. So I think one can maybe propose then that I'm wondering what you think of this, right?
Yeah.
Is a way of discussing continuity, discontinuity, not just in terms of continuity, discontinuity, not just discontinuity, but maybe uncontinuity, or in another pronunciation, continuity. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And we had like an extensive chat yesterday. And I told you, in a sense, like what I have primarily in mind in this project is no longer théorie du sujet, but being an event one. And roughly speaking, I think the one I'm talking about here, if you are more into Badiou, is my understanding of the count as one. The count as one as sheer operation. The count as one, which is not the count as one in a situation as one multiple as effect. So, I mean, this is one of my wagers in a sense. And then we had this conversation with Alenka, this will take me elsewhere. Like, am I just saying that, but you and Lacan are the same? No, but here, yes. Especially if where is Frank? Okay, anyway. If you agree, this makes sense as soon as you agree that in against mainstream Badiousian, and actually I wanted Frank here because we are rereading the book like nth time, and we agree on this basic point, which puts us at odds with most mainstream Badiousian. If you do agree that at the end of the day, the count as one, the void, and the retrospective inconsistent multiple are, as Badiou says, one and the same thing, then Lacan is saying the same. It's not a kind of language, it's less systematic, but at the same time, it's much more ontologically inclined than Miller and mainstream Lacanians want us to believe it is, And just very quickly, because you brought in like several super interesting issues, in relation to that, yes, I'm trying to play down this idea of the pre-ontological, neither being nor non-being, on which commentators have dwelt, because, in a sense, this misses the point about the unconscious is a concept, in a sense. Of course, ontically, phenomenologically, but that's Freud. This is precisely the step from Freud to Lacan. This is the Lacanian unconscious. It's still Freudian, but when you're talking about Freud, I think, it is pre-ontological, it's neither being nor non-being, whereas this is all fine, but it's much more complex. For Lacan, you have to add this level. Last point, in answer to your question, the outside and beside. I mean, the beside, obviously, I'm forcing it a bit, I'm pushing it, because the general project, more personalized, I call it para-ontology, but it's really important because I mentioned it in passing. I mean, one of the greatest independently from Badiou, I think intuitions here, as I read Lacan in Seminar 11 already, is the idea that we should not mix, we should not confuse the anti-conceptual with the non-conceptual, right? So basically here you have a triangle, right? The triangle is the Onbegriff, let's say the count as one in Badiou, the Unbegriff, the non-concept, which would be the inconsistent multiple, if you wish. And then, of course, there's unbewusste, in a sense, which, let's say, would be the situation in Badiou. But then, actually, there is the outside. But the outside, basically, the background, he calls it here. That is the anti-conceptual. So Lacan is basically saying we cannot think the cause of the cause. The cause is language, right? But thinking the cause of the cause, we cannot think it. But we should not mix that anti-conceptual level with the non-conceptual level. Put in Badiousian terms, it would be like saying we should not confuse inconsistent multiplicity with what would be being outside of presentation. It's absolutely, oh no. I just wanted like a Badiousian voice to corroborate the discussion. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. Yes, the other shot is yeah. But last sentence, I agree. There's always this oscillation in Badiou, you know, like, jusqu'ici tout va bien, you know, like, he's great, except that, you know, it's a kind of like Manoni thing, you know, like, I know very well that Lacan is great, but still, you know, like, there's something that doesn't work. And you already have that in theory of the subject. I'm not saying that what I'm saying cannot be mapped back onto theory of the subject. I'm just saying, like, right now I'm more comfortable with being an event, but yeah, makes sense.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was a wonderful paper. Just very brief reflection, but hopefully a question there as well. So this idea of the one concept, which is related to the cut in that passage, right? Namely the cut, made me think about the way in Upir, Lacan talks about the sort of bifidity of the zero and the one. You also mentioned it, the empty set within the set, right? I mean, the empty set that has to be part of any set. And that's always one of the central concerns with Lacan, this sort of hesitation between the zero and the one, and how the subject could come into being in that sort of hesitation between the zero and the one. So I was just wondering, this formal ontology of the concept of the unconscious that you expounded in this talk, would it, in some sense, then make the distinction between real as an impasse of formalization, in brackets, maybe real as an impasse of mathematical formalization? Would it make the distinction between real as an impasse of mathematical formalization and mathematics as ontology, as the science of being qua being in Badiou, would it nullify the distinction between the two? So can we say then, if we recover this kind of a formal ontology that you are recovering, I feel, from Lacan, will it then be saying that there is mathematics as ontology in Lacan?
Yes. Quick answer is yes, but quick answer, yes. Quick answer, yes, and very briefly, in a sense, I think what we need to think is the unconscious as sets, which comes, this is just the foundations of going that direction, which I worked on like throughout last year, but then with the proviso that this is not the whole story. That is to say, I do think that, so you have like the ontogenetic structural, i.e. descriptive level of ontology in Lacan, and then you have a formal level of ontology, which is the level of formalization. This is what he's trying to do there, right? And yes, I do think also on an exegetical basis, there are good reasons to claim that the only ontology of being as presented being that is appropriate as a discourse of being is also for Lacan mathematics. Then the specification would be, does it have to be, this is a discussion with Marx, who works on topology. Why not topology instead of set theory, given that it pushes things farther there? So yeah, I think I don't have an answer to that. But then your point is like, you have like other analysts in the 60s and 70s who actually try to formalize the unconscious by a set in a non-Lacanian way, like Marc Blanco, right? So then the question is, so should we push it all the way? Should we push it both theoretically and practically? Should we push it all the way? And my point would be no. I mean, this kind of understanding of the unconscious as a mathematical ontology, should we push it all the way? And the answer is no, precisely because of what is also about using reason, that is to say the fact that mathematical ontology, as you know, is unreceptive to the event. And this is like, this is still in the making, but you know, like having this conversation with some people recently, mainly, but it's like up to clinicians to say, no, I mean, you're just like on the wrong track. But I would say actually, the very strict on mathematical formalization of the unconscious, maybe I see more of a validity of that in terms of the clinic. Because at the end of the day, you know, like, you know, the formulas of the equation, I'm simplifying, but in a way, locating yourself in the formulas of the equation is what analysis is about, isn't it, somehow? So I paradoxically see this formalizing avenue as potentially more important for practice than for theory.
Okay.
The question was really nice and complex, so I tried to answer it.
One very last question, and then we end this panel.
Thanks, Lorenzo. I mean, just to tie up almost everything that's been said in the discussion, and then actually pose a question. Yes, I'm not giving a summary. I'm giving an axiomatic rendering, which is that basically, you don't slap the table, slap me if I'm wrong, but to reopen the Pandora's box from November, I mean, the difference between the kind of existence of the unary trait and the kind of existence of the master signifier, that is ontological difference for Lacan, right? Just put very simply, right? So I think that what that allows you to say, though, is, or rather, the question that raises, and it's very similar to Emily's, so I'm trying to come full circle, is, okay, but there are 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, even though it makes sense, everything that you said today, which would seem to suggest that they have to be concepts in different ways, right? So, in particular, how do you account for the others as concepts that are? Thank you.
That's a very good question.
Try to answer into mic.
It's a very difficult question. It's a good question, and I'll try to answer briefly about one of the other concepts. One of the other 4 fundamental concepts is repetition. What is repetition? Repetition is the repetition of this. I'm sorry, I'm really simplifying here. But, you know, like, what is going on in fantasy is the promotion of the unary trait to the status of the primary signifier, the master signifier, around which or through which, now I'm not being very specific, repetition works. Repetition repeats itself. How to actually translate this and apply it to the transference, I don't have an answer. Well, drive also can be linked quite easily in a sense, because what drives in what circles in repetition is drive, right? Yeah. So if you have such understanding, formal understanding of the unconscious, I think the connection with drive and repetition, you know, as long as you have like a theory of fantasy, you basically have your own theory of the logic of fantasy, you think this is what Lacan says, I think it's unproblematic. How to relate it to the clinical, to transference, not my turf, in a sense. But to go back to Arca, just 1 minute, because I think at the beginning you said something, and I wanted to actually make a specification. You said, rightly so, you said like, you really closely linked the one concept of the grief and the cat. No, I'm not linked, they are the same. So it's not a link.
They are the same.
They are the same. Yeah. Because if they're not,
that's the 0-1 problem, right? I mean,
exactly.
One constant.
Exactly.
That is a cut.
Exactly.
A 0.
Which is why the previous question was bringing back, you know, like, but you know, the name of being, you know, the void is the name of being, right? Which is nothing but the mathematical symbol for, you never are in touch with the void, you see my point? But this is very important, because if you don't say that the one concept is nothing but the trait and vice versa, then What kind of one is that? How can you speak of, one concept seems the opposite of anti-idealism. Right? Only in this way. Only if it is an operation, my banging the table, the relationship is not with the touch aspect, but with the operationality of it, but 0-1 as well. The one is the one, 719, that undoes itself, right? Lacan said, this is important. This is the one that undoes itself, right?
Okay, thank you, Lorenzo. Let's give an applause to Lorenzo. I have something to say afterwards.